Harold Whitaker slid the debt papers across the table and said, "Send your daughter to Carter Ranch. Let him reject her publicly. That's all I need." Her father's hands shook. Lillian Rose picked up the pen herself. She signed not because she surrendered, but because she had already decided what she was going to do when she got there. She was not going to play Harold's game. She was not going to be his weapon. She was going to walk up to the richest cowboy in Montana, look him in the eye, and tell him the absolute truth. Nobody expected what happened next. Subscribe to our channel. Stay until the very last moment and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The debt notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, which was the cruelest kind of morning, ordinary enough to give a person hope, then cold enough to take it away before noon. Lillian Rose was standing at the kitchen window when her father came through the door. She didn't need to see the paper in his hand to know what it meant. She could read it in the way his shoulders had stopped fighting gravity, in the way his boots scraped across the floor instead of lifting. Thomas Rose had carried himself with quiet dignity for as long as Lillian could remember, even through the drought years. Even through the season, they ate cornmeal for 6 weeks straight. Even through the winter, they burned fence posts just to keep warm. But something about the way he moved that Tuesday morning told her that the last piece of ground he'd been standing on had finally given way beneath his feet. "How much?" she asked. He set the paper on the table without looking at her. She read the number. She read it twice. "Daddy." Her voice was steady. She made it steady on purpose. "Sit down." "I've been sitting down for 3 years," he said. "Sitting down and watching everything I built go to pieces. The drought wasn't your fault. The debt is." She didn't argue with that. There was no point. Thomas Rose had borrowed from Harold Whitaker's lending office 4 years ago, when the land still held promise and the rains still came on schedule. He'd borrowed to buy seed to repair the well to keep going one more season. And then the rain stopped, and the seed didn't grow, and the well turned brackish, and Harold Whitaker's interest rate kept climbing like a fever with nowhere to break. "He's coming himself," her father said. "Tomorrow morning. Says he wants to discuss our options." Lillian folded the paper carefully and set it back on the table. She already knew there would be no options. When Harold Whitaker came to discuss options, he came to deliver terms. The man had not built his business empire in Cutter County, Montana, by offering people real choices. He offered the appearance of choice, which was something entirely different, a door that opened onto a wall. She spent that night thinking instead of sleeping. She lay in the narrow bed she'd slept in since childhood and stared at the ceiling and ran through every calculation she knew how to run. The land was worth something, not much, not after the drought years, but something. The cattle they had left were thin but alive. The equipment was old. None of it added up to the number on that paper. None of it came close. By the time the gray light started pressing through the curtains, Lillian had arrived at the only conclusion available to her. There was no financial solution, which meant the solution had to be something else entirely. Harold Whitaker arrived at 9 o'clock, which told Lillian something immediately. A man who came at 9 o'clock came before the town was fully awake. He came before witnesses gathered on porches and outside the general store. He came at a time when anything said or agreed to could later be remembered differently, depending on who was doing the remembering. How was a large man? Harold not tall, but wide in the way of men who had spent decades eating well, while others went without. He wore a suit that cost more than Lillian's family had earned in the past 2 years. His hat was clean. His boots showed no trail dust, which meant he'd ridden in a covered buggy, even though the road from town was only 3 miles. Harold Whitaker did not let dirt touch him if he could help it. He sat down at their kitchen table without being invited to sit. "Thomas," he said, "I'll get straight to the point." "I'd appreciate that," her father said. Harold placed his hands flat on the table, a gesture that said he owned every surface he touched. "Your debt has reached a number you cannot repay. We both know this. I could take the farm today. Legally, I could have taken it 6 months ago." He paused, letting that sit. "But I'm not a heartless man." Lillian, standing near the window, said nothing. She watched his eyes instead of listening to his words because a man's eyes usually told a more honest story than his mouth. "I have a proposition," Harold continued. "One that resolves your debt entirely." Her father straightened slightly. "I'm listening." Harold glanced at Lillian then. Just briefly. But it was the kind of glance that measured and appraised the kind of glance a man gave livestock at auction, not a young woman standing in her own home. "Elias Carter," Harold said. The name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Elias Carter was the largest landowner in the county. He ran 3,000 acres north of town, had water rights to the Crow Creek tributary that made his land worth more than everything else in Cutter County combined. He was known as a man of few words and absolute convictions, a man who had never once bent to anyone's pressure, which made him either admirable or dangerous, depending on your relationship with him. Harold and Elias Carter had history. The whole county knew it. Harold had tried to purchase Carter's water rights 2 years ago through a business arrangement that Elias had declined so bluntly that the story was still told at the barber shop on slow afternoons. "What about him?" Thomas asked. "Carter is looking for a wife," Harold said. "He's been looking for some time, in fact. A man in his position needs a suitable match, someone to manage the household, someone respectable." He paused. "I happen to be in a position to make an introduction." Lillian felt the shape of what was coming before he finished saying it. "If your daughter agrees to present herself to Carter as a potential bride," Harold said, "I will forgive the entirety of your debt. The farm stays in your name. I'll even repair the well." The room went completely quiet. Her father turned to look at her. She could see the war happening behind his eyes, the shame fighting the desperation, the love for her, fighting the love for everything he'd spent his life building. "And if Carter agrees to the match," Thomas asked carefully. "Then your troubles are permanently resolved," Harold said. "Carter's resources would stabilize your farm without difficulty." "And if he doesn't agree?" Harold smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Then at least the debt is forgiven. Your family keeps the land regardless of his decision." He spread his hands as if offering a gift. "Everyone benefits." Lillian took one step away from the window. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. Her voice was calm. "I'd like to speak with you directly, please." Harold looked at her, the way men like him looked at women who spoke without first being acknowledged, a brief flicker of surprise that resolved into condescending tolerance. "Of course," he said. "What do you actually want from this?" she asked. "I just explained." "You explained what you're offering us," she said. "I'm asking what you want for yourself, because I've lived in this county my whole life, and I have never once seen Harold Whitaker do something that didn't serve Harold Whitaker." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Her father stared at her. Harold's expression shifted not to anger, not yet, but to something more calculating. He was reassessing her. She could feel it the way you feel a change in the air before weather turns. "Your daughter is direct," Harold said to her father, but his eyes stayed on Lillian. "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "She is. I'll be direct as well then." Harold folded his hands. "Elias Carter and I have unresolved business. He's made it clear he won't deal with me professionally. I believe a social introduction through a mutual acquaintance, so to speak, might open doors that have been closed." It was the most honest thing he'd said since sitting down, which meant it was still a lie, just a better constructed one. Lillian looked at her father. She looked at the debt paper on the table. She looked at the window that faced the field her father had worked for 30 years, that had fed this family through good times and nearly destroyed it through bad ones. "Give me tonight to think about it," she said. She did not sleep that second night either. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table long after her father went to bed, and she thought about Harold Whitaker's smile. She thought about the way he'd looked at her. She thought about what it meant to be sent somewhere as a weapon without knowing you were a weapon. Because she understood now what Harold's plan actually was. He did not believe Elias Carter was looking for a wife. He did not believe this would lead to a marriage or to any genuine social warming between them. What Harold believed what he was counting on was humiliation. How was going to send a poor farmer's daughter in a mended dress and worn boots to the front door of the wealthiest man in the county, and Elias Carter, proud private unbending. Elias Carter would look at her, see exactly what Harold had sent, understand the insult beneath it, and send her away with the kind of contempt that would become legendary in a county that loved its stories. And Harold would have won something. Not the water rights, not the land, but something that mattered to men like him even more, the satisfaction of having made Elias Carter look foolish, of having made him react, of having cracked the composure of a man who had humiliated Harold 2 years ago simply by saying no. Lillian was not meant to win anything. She was meant to be used and discarded. She pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her and wrote down 2 columns. On the left side, she wrote what she had. On the right side, she wrote what she needed. The left column was short. The right column was longer. But she looked at that left column for a very long time, because the left column contained things that couldn't be measured in dollars. Her father's good name with the neighboring farms. Her own knowledge of the land and how to work it. 7 years of watching her father negotiate, manage, fail, recover, and refuse to quit. The ability to read people not from books, but from the particular education of growing up without enough, which taught you very quickly who was genuine and who was performing generosity for an audience. And one more thing, the truth. She had the truth which Harold Whitaker did not, because men like Harold had spent so many years arranging facts to serve them that they'd lost track of the difference between a story and reality. When morning came, she knocked on her father's bedroom door. "Tell Whitaker I'll go," she said. Her father opened the door and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something between grief and awe. "Lily, I'm not going for the reason he thinks I'm going," she said. "And I'm not going to be what he thinks I'll be when I get there. You don't know Elias Carter." "No," she said, "but Harold Whitaker doesn't know me." The ride to Carter Ranch took most of the morning. Harold Whitaker's man drove her in a modest buggy, not the covered one Harold himself used, which told her that even the transportation was calculated. Arrive unimpressively. Don't let the setting do any work for you. Let the contrast between her and the place speak for itself. She used the time to think about what she knew of Elias Carter. I was 38 years old, according to County Talk. He'd arrived in Montana when he was barely 20, working as a hired hand on someone else's spread, and had built his own operation through a combination of hard work, shrewd negotiation, and an apparently complete indifference to what other people thought of his methods. He had no known family in the area. He had associates, not friends, or at least that was how people described him. He'd turned down several marriage proposals over the years from women far better positioned than Lillian, which had generated considerable gossip, and the general conclusion that he was either too dedicated to his work to care about personal life, or simply too difficult for any woman to tolerate long-term. She also knew he'd turned down Harold Whitaker's offer on the water rights, not because the money wasn't right, but according to the barbershop version of the story, because he'd simply said, "I don't do business with men who need what I have more than they need, to be honest." That one sentence had lived in Lillian's memory since she'd first heard it. She thought about it now, rolling over the rutted road, her small suitcase wedged beside her. A man who said something like that either meant it entirely or was performing a version of himself, so practiced it had become indistinguishable from genuine character. She needed to find out which one was true before she said a single word she couldn't take back. The driver turned the buggy through a gate, and Carter Ranch opened up ahead. She did not let herself be impressed by it. She had one task when she stepped down from that buggy. One task only. Tell the truth. Not the truth Harold had constructed. Not the version of events that made her look desperate and him look charitable. The actual truth. The uncomfortable, unflattering, strategically inconvenient truth about exactly why she was standing on his property and who had sent her and what they expected to happen. Whatever Elias Carter decided after that was his to decide. She stepped down from the buggy without waiting for the driver's help. A man came out from the direction of the main barn, not hurrying, not welcoming, just covering the ground between them, with the even purposeful stride of someone who went where they intended to go and did not particularly adjust their speed for anyone. He stopped about 6 feet away from her. She looked at him directly. She had been told he was serious. What she saw was something more precise than serious, a man who had learned that most social exchanges were a kind of negotiation, and who had consequently stopped performing the rituals of social exchange and simply waited to see what someone actually needed. "Miss Rose," he said. "Yes." She didn't offer her hand. She didn't smile the way you smiled when you wanted someone to like you before they knew you. "Mr. Carter, before anything else I need to tell you something, and I'd appreciate it if you let me finish before you respond." Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but sharpening the way. Attention sharpens when something unexpected happens. "Go ahead," he said. "Harold Whitaker sent me here," she said. "He paid my family's debt in exchange for me making this visit. He told my father he was arranging a potential marriage introduction. He is not. He doesn't believe you'll agree to anything. He is expecting you to send me away immediately and publicly, which he plans to use against your reputation. Somehow, I'm not entirely certain how, but I know Harold Whitaker well enough to know that public humiliation is always the point." She paused. "My family's debt is forgiven regardless of what happens here today. He put that in writing. So I'm not here asking you for anything. I'm here because I thought you deserved to know what was actually happening on your own property." The wind moved between them. Elias Carter looked at her for a long moment. His expression had not changed in the way she'd expected. She'd half prepared herself for anger, for the particular cold fury of a proud man informed he's being manipulated. Instead, he looked at her the way people looked at something they were trying to accurately understand. "How old are you?" he said. 22. "And you figured all of that out yourself?" "I had 2 nights," she said. "I think clearly when I'm not sleeping." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was the closest neighbor to one. "Harold Whitaker," he said, "has been trying to rattle me for 2 years. "I know. And his best idea was to send you." "Apparently." He looked at her for another moment. "What's in the suitcase?" She blinked. Of all the questions she had prepared for, that one had not made the list. 2 changes of clothes, a book, my mother's journal. Not much. I didn't know how long I'd be gone." She held his gaze. "I still don't." He nodded slowly. Then he said the thing that neither she nor Harold Whitaker had anticipated, the thing that would change everything that came after, though she didn't fully understand that yet. "They told me you were worth nothing," he said. He paused. "They were wrong." He looked at her steadily. "A woman with your courage is worth more than gold." She didn't answer right away because the words had done something unexpected. They had not simply been a compliment. They had been an observation. He'd said it the way you say something when you've just identified a fact about the world that you think people should know. "I came here to warn you," she said. "That's all I came to do." "I know," he said. "And now that you've done it, I have a question." "All right." "Your family's farm," he said. "The drought damage, the well. How bad is it actually?" She was not expecting that question either. "Bad," she said honestly. "The soil on the south field is recoverable if we can get water to it before next planting season. The north field might be a loss. The well needs new casing, and probably deepening. My father thinks 18 feet, I think it's closer to 25, damn. He absorbed that. You've looked at it carefully. I've been looking at it for 3 years. And Harold holds the reformed debt note regardless." "He forgave the debt," she said. "It's in writing. Whatever happens here, the farm stays with my father." "What he gets from writing that note," Elias said, "is the ability to say he helped your family, which in this county means he owns your father's goodwill." Lillian went very still. She had not thought that far. She had been so focused on protecting the immediate situation, the farm, the land, her father's dignity, that she had not seen what Harold had actually purchased. Her father would feel obligated to Harold Whitaker for the rest of his life. He would speak well of him. He would vote with him. He would be in every way that mattered in a small county, in 1887, Harold Whitaker's man. She had outmaneuvered one part of the trap and walked straight into the other. "I see," she said quietly. "Don't look like that," Elias said. "You just got here." "I thought I was smarter than this." "You're 22 and you walked into Harold Whitaker's office without a lawyer," he said. Being outsmarted by Harold doesn't say anything about your intelligence. It says something about his experience. He turned and looked toward the barn for a moment. Then he turned back. "Come inside," he said. "I'll have someone bring your bag. We have things to discuss." "I'm not staying," she said. "I told you I don't need anything from you. Miss Rose." He said her name the same way he said everything without decoration. "Harold Whitaker is going to spend the next several months trying to make your father's life difficult enough that the written debt forgiveness becomes worthless. The farm will still be yours legally and be unworkable practically." He paused. "Unless someone with resources and legal standing does something to prevent that, which I am in a position to do." He waited. "Now, would you like to come inside and talk about this like two people with a common problem, or would you prefer to be independent and lose?" She looked at him. He looked back. "Fine," she said, "but I want to be clear about something." "I expect you'll be clear about everything," he said. "You seem to have made a habit of it." "This is not a marriage arrangement," she said. "I didn't come here for that, and I won't pretend otherwise." "Agreed," he said. "I'm not interested in arrangements. I'm interested in whether you're as practical as you seem to be." He started walking toward the house. "Come on then, coffee's still hot." She picked up her suitcase and followed him. Behind her, the driver from Whitaker's buggy had already turned around and was heading back toward town. Within the hour, Harold Whitaker would know that Elias Carter had not sent her away, and he would not be pleased. She thought about that as she walked through Elias Carter's front door, the fact that Harold had expected this meeting to be over in minutes, and instead, it was just beginning. That the chess piece he'd moved across the board had sat down at the table and started playing its own game. She didn't know yet whether she could win, but she knew with the certainty of someone who had been thinking clearly through 2 sleepless nights that she was no longer the person being played. She was playing. Time. The kitchen at Carter Ranch was large and functional in a way that told her something about the man who lived there. No decoration for decoration's sake. Everything within reach of everything it needed to be near. A table worn smooth from use, not from age. Coffee on the stove, like he said. 2 cups already on the table, which meant either he'd prepared for a longer conversation than he'd let on outside, or someone else had set them there. A woman in her 60s came in from the back and stopped when she saw Lillian. "This is May," Elias said. "She runs the house." May looked at Lillian with the frank, uncurated expression of someone who had been on this ranch long enough to say whatever she thought without filtering it. "You're the Rose girl," May said. "Yes." "You're skinnier than I expected." "May," Elias said. "She is," May said without apology. She disappeared back through the doorway and came back 30 seconds later with a plate of cornbread that she set directly in front of Lillian. "Eat something. You look like you spent the night thinking instead of sleeping." Lillian looked at the cornbread. She looked at May. "How did you know that?" "Because that's what smart women do when they're in trouble," May said. "They think instead of sleeping, and they show up somewhere looking like they've already had 3 arguments with themselves." She poured coffee into both cups and left the room. Elias sat down across from Lillian. "She's been here since the ranch was 50 acres and a broken fence," he said. "She's perceptive," Lillian said. "Everyone on this ranch is perceptive," he said. "It's the main qualification for staying." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Tell me about the South Field. What would it take to recover it?" She ate a piece of cornbread because she was in fact hungry, and pretending otherwise seemed like the wrong kind of pride for this particular moment. And then she told him exactly what the South Field would take. She told him about the soil composition and the irrigation problem, and the 3 different approaches her father had tried, and why each one had partially failed. She told him about the neighboring Harmon farm, whose south-facing fields had recovered after they'd redirected water from their creek, and why the same approach wouldn't work for the Rose property because the creek angle was wrong. Elias Carter listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. Both questions were exactly the right questions, which told her he understood the land the way she'd hoped, not as an abstract asset, but as a living system with specific needs. When she finished, he said, "There's a way to run a channel from the Crow Creek tributary to your south field. The grade works. It would take about 3 weeks to dig." "That's your water," she said. Yes. You'd let us use it. Not let, he said. I'd sell the rights for a reasonable annual fee, something your family could actually pay once the farm is producing. He looked at her. But the channel would have to be built first, which takes labor and materials. Which we don't have. Which I do, he said. And which I am willing to put in as a loan, a real loan with written terms and interest that doesn't move with the farm as collateral. He paused. A loan Harold Whitaker cannot interfere with because I will personally hold the note. Lillian set down her coffee cup. This was the moment she needed to think most carefully. Because what he was offering was not charity and not a trick. It was on its face a genuine business arrangement. The kind of arrangement that could actually solve the problem. But she was 22 years old, and she had already walked into one part of a trap she hadn't seen. She was not going to walk into another. What do you get from this? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. Harold Whitaker loses. That's all? That's considerable, he said. Harold has been maneuvering in this county for 15 years. He destroys the families he can't use. He has done it to 3 farms north of town that I know of personally. He sent you here because he thought I would participate in doing it to yours. Something in his expression shifted, not anger exactly, but a kind of settled determination. I don't participate in that. Even at cost to yourself. The cost is 3 weeks of labor and a water rights agreement, he said. The benefit is that Harold Whitaker learns one more time that his plans stop at my fence line. He looked at her steadily. And you stop looking at me like I'm the second part of someone else's trap. She held his gaze. Are you? She asked. No, he said. How do I know that? You don't, he said. Not yet. That's what time is for. She looked down at her coffee. She looked at the cornbread plate May had left. She looked at the worn surface of the table and thought about her father's table worn the same way from the same kind of daily use. My father would have to agree, she said. Of course. And I want to see the written terms before anything is signed. I'd expect nothing less. And I'm not, this isn't... She stopped, then started again more precisely. I came here to warn you. That was the only plan I came with. Whatever this is now, I need it to be clear that I'm not here as Harold intended me to be. Miss Rose. His voice was patient but direct. I understood that the moment you opened your mouth in the yard. You don't need to keep establishing it. She nodded. One more thing, she said. Go ahead. May, she said. Does she have any more of that cornbread? Something shifted in his expression, then something that loosened fractionally around the edges. Not a laugh. Not quite. But the next nearest thing. May, he called without raising his voice much. From the back room, already cut another piece. Lillian Rose sat at Elias Carter's kitchen table, ate cornbread, and for the first time in 2 sleepless nights felt something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to peace, that her shoulders came down half an inch. Outside, the morning was moving toward noon. Somewhere in town, Harold Whitaker's driver was arriving back without news of a quick dismissal, and Harold Whitaker was beginning to understand that his careful plan had not gone the way he'd drawn it, that the girl he'd sent to be humiliated had not been humiliated, that the cowboy he'd meant to rattle had not been rattled, and that somewhere between a debt paper and a kitchen table, 2 people who were supposed to be pawns in someone else's game had quietly decided to become something else entirely. The agreement between Elias Carter and Lillian Rose was not announced. It was not written up in the county paper. It was not discussed at the general store, or the church steps, or the barber shop on Saturday morning. But Red Hollow, Montana was a small county in 1887, and a small county had its own system of information, faster than telegram, more detailed than newspaper, and considerably less accurate than either. By Thursday, people knew the girl had not come back the same day she left. By Friday, they knew she was still at Carter Ranch. By the following Tuesday, the story had been told and retold enough times that it had developed several new features that bore no relationship to anything that had actually happened, including the version where Elias Carter had reportedly proposed on the front porch within the first 10 minutes, and the version where Lillian had reportedly arrived with forged documents claiming land rights, and the version somehow the most popular, where Harold Whitaker had orchestrated the entire meeting as an act of generosity toward a struggling family. Lillian heard none of these versions directly, but May heard all of them because May went to town on Wednesday mornings for supplies and came back knowing everything that had been said, thought, or speculated within a 20-mile radius. "They're saying Harold Whitaker is a good man for setting this up," May reported, setting flour and dried beans on the kitchen shelf with the careful deliberateness of someone delivering difficult news. "3 people told me so this morning, at 3 separate stops." Lillian looked up from the ledger she'd been reviewing. Elias had asked her 2 days after she'd stayed on at the ranch if she would look at his supply accounts. Not because he needed help, the ranch ran efficiently, and she could see that immediately, but because he'd said with characteristic directness that a second set of eyes that noticed different things was worth more than everyone agreeing. She had taken the ledger without commenting on what it meant that he'd handed it to her. She simply opened it and started reading. 3 people, she said now. 3 separate stops, May confirmed. "He's telling the story around town that he personally arranged your introduction to Mr. Carter as a kindness to your father. And people believe him. People believe the story that costs them nothing to believe," May said. "Harold Whitaker as a generous man costs them nothing. It's easier than the truth." Lillian set the pen down. She had already found 2 discrepancies in the supply ledger, neither large enough to be fraud, both large enough to be patterns, and she had been thinking about whether to mention them or wait until she was certain. Now she was thinking about Harold Whitaker standing in the center of Red Hollow and narrating her life as if he'd authored it. "Does Mr. Carter know?" she asked. "Mr. Carter knew before I got back," May said. "He has his own sources." She found Elias in the south barn with his foreman, a compact, weathered man named Roy Hatch, who had been running Carter Ranch operations for 11 years, and who looked at Lillian every single time he saw her with an expression of neutral assessment that she was working hard to convert to something warmer. "I heard about town," she said. Elias didn't look up from the harness he was examining. "I know. Harold is positioning himself as the generous party." "I know that too." "It bothers you," she said. Not a question. He looked up then. "It bothers me when dishonesty gets traction," he said. "What Harold is doing in town right now is building a story. Stories are hard to correct once they're built." Roy Hatch said nothing, but she noticed he was listening carefully while appearing not to. "Then we need to build a different story," Lillian said. Elias set the harness down. "How?" "Not by correcting Harold directly," she said. "That makes it look like a dispute, and in a dispute between Harold Whitaker and a poor farmer's daughter, Harold wins on reputation alone." She thought for a moment. "We let people see something true, not hear something true, see it." "What does that mean practically?" "The Water Channel Project," she said. "When your crew starts digging, people will notice. They notice everything. When they ask why, the men on the crew will say what they know, that Carter Ranch is running a water access project for the Rose Farm on proper commercial terms." She met his gaze. "That's a story that tells itself without anyone having to argue it." Roy Hatch made a small sound that might have been approval. Elias looked at her for a moment. "You think 3 steps ahead," he said. "I've had to," she said simply. "Growing up poor teaches you to look at what's coming before it arrives." There was a pause. Roy picked up the harness and moved to the other end of the barn without being asked, giving them the conversation space in the uncomplicated, unobtrusive way of a man who understood people well. "There's something else," Lillian said. "The ledger." She blinked. "You already looked at it." "I looked at it when you did," he said. "I saw your expression change twice, once at page 12, once at page 19. She had not realized he was watching that closely. "Supply charges from a vendor in Billings," she said. "The amount increases 12% every quarter like clockwork. Too regular to be market fluctuation." "Roy noticed it 8 months ago," Elias said. "We're already looking into it." He paused. "But you caught it in 3 hours without anyone telling you where to look." She didn't respond to that as a compliment because she didn't think he meant it as one. He meant it as information the same way he said everything. "Is there a connection to Harold Whitaker?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. The particular quality of a man recalibrating how much he'd underestimated someone. Why would you ask that? Because Harold runs 3 businesses in this county, one of which involves supply brokering, she said. And a vendor overcharge that increases at a fixed rate isn't random, it's confident. It's the kind of confidence you have when you believe the person being charged won't look closely enough to catch you. Elias was quiet for a long moment. The vendor in Billings, he said finally, has a partial ownership stake that traces back to a holding company in Helena. He paused. Roy found that 2 weeks ago. Does the holding company connect to Whitaker? We're still tracing it, he said. But yes, we think so. The barn was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch continuing its day. Horses men, working the ordinary machinery of a place that ran because people kept it running. He's been stealing from you, she said. Carefully, Elias said. Small enough to stay invisible, consistent enough to add up. For how long? Possibly 3 years. She absorbed that. 3 years of careful, systematic skimming from the largest ranch in the county, from a man known for his precision and his intolerance of dishonesty. The boldness of it was almost impressive in the way terrible things sometimes were. He needed you to not look closely, she said. Everyone assumes the amounts are too small to matter, Elias said. That's how it works. He does that with the farmers he loans to too, she said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. The interest rate that moves, the debt that grows faster than the math explains. Small enough to seem like normal variance, large enough to matter over time. She looked at him. It's the same method. Yes, he said quietly. He has a system, she said. He does. Which means there are records somewhere, she said. You can't run a system like that without records. He needs to track what he's taken, and from whom, or eventually it falls apart. Elias looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not quite surprised because she'd gotten the sense he didn't surprise easily, but something adjacent to it. Focused attention. The kind of attention that meant he was listening not just to what she said, but to how she was thinking. If we find those records, she said, we don't just stop what he's doing to you. We stop what he's doing to everyone. That's a large if, he said. Yes, she agreed. But it's the right if. Roy Hatch from the far end of the barn said without turning around. She's not wrong, boss. Elias looked in Roy's direction, then back at Lillian. No, he said. She's not. The water channel project started the following Monday. 4 men from Carter Ranch plus 2, hired from the Harmon spread to the east, began the work of cutting a secondary channel from the Crow Creek tributary toward the Rose Farm's south field. The work was physical, muddy, and visible from the road, which was, as Lillian had calculated, the most important part. She was not present for the first day of digging. She spent it at the Rose farmhouse with her father going through the actual terms of the loan agreement that Elias's lawyer had drawn up. A man named Archibald Fenn, who rode out from Miles City, and who looked at Lillian with the studied professional neutrality of someone who had learned to reserve judgment about unusual situations until he had all the information. Thomas Rose read the agreement 3 times. It's fair, he said finally, with the tone of a man who had not expected that and wasn't entirely sure how to respond to it. It's more than fair, Lillian said. The interest rate is fixed, the repayment schedule is tied to harvest yields, and the water access rights are in perpetuity, not contingent on continued loan payments. Her father looked up. Perpetuity, he said. That's a strong word. I asked for it specifically, she said. Mr. Carter agreed. Her father was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of the digging crew beginning their work somewhere down the road. The rhythmic sound of men moving earth, with the steady, deliberate pace of people who understood that large things got done, one shovelful at a time. What's between you and Carter? Her father asked. A business arrangement, she said. Lily. Daddy. He looked at her for a long moment. He's not doing this because it's good business, he said. The water rights alone are worth more than this loan. He's doing it because Harold Whitaker is stealing from him, she said. And from us. And from probably 6 other families in this county. And because we both want to stop it. Her father absorbed that. Harold forgave our debt, he said carefully. Harold bought your goodwill, she said. And he did it specifically because he knew it would cost you something to hear that. She kept her voice gentle because she loved her father, and she understood what it felt like to be told that a relief you'd accepted was actually a rope. He put the forgiveness in writing because a written note creates obligation without needing to say so. Thomas Rose looked at his hands on the table. He was a man who had spent 30 years doing honest work on honest land, and what he was hearing was that the world did not always respond to honesty in kind. "What do I do?" he asked quietly. "Sign the agreement with Mr. Carter," she said. "Let the channel be built. Let the farm recover." She paused. "And when Harold Whitaker comes around expecting gratitude, be polite and say nothing that commits you to anything. That doesn't feel like enough." "It's the beginning," she said, "not the end." She signed as a witness when her father signed the agreement. Archibald Fenn sealed it, packed his case, and rode back toward Miles City with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned that the less he commented on his clients' choices, the longer they kept him employed. That evening, when Lillian returned to Carter Ranch, she found the dining room table covered with documents, not the supply ledger. Different papers, older, denser. The kind of records that came from official sources rather than day-to-day operations. Elias was seated at the table with Roy Hatch and a third man she hadn't met, younger, with ink stains on his right hand and the look of someone who spent most of his time reading things other people found boring. "Miss Rose," Elias said, "this is Daniel Webb. He works in the county recorder's office." Daniel Webb looked up with the expression of someone not entirely certain they should be where they were. "Evening, miss?" "Mr. Webb has been helping us trace the ownership structure of Harold's supply companies," Elias said. He glanced at her, then at the table. "We found something." She pulled out the nearest chair and sat down. "Show me." Roy laid 3 documents side by side. She looked at them carefully. They were land transfer records, 3 of them spanning the past 4 years. Each one showed a different small farm transferring ownership in 3 cases, through foreclosure in all 3 cases, to a holding company. "These are the 3 North farms," she said. "The ones you mentioned." "Owned now by a company called Halcyon Land Trust," Elias said. "Registered in Helena." "Which connects to the supply vendor." "Which connects," Roy said, "to a second company called Western Agricultural Partners, which has 2 officers of record." He put his finger on a name at the bottom of one document. She leaned in and read it. The first name was an attorney from Helena she didn't recognize. The second name was Harold J. Whitaker. She sat back. "He's not just collecting debt," she said. "He's collecting land." "Systematically," Elias said. "The loans create the debt. The interest manipulation makes the debt unresolvable. The foreclosure transfers the land. The supply skimming takes money from larger operations in the meantime." He paused. "It's a complete system." "He's been building this for years," she said. "At least 5, Daniel Webb said quietly from his end of the table. "Possibly longer. These are just the records I could access. There are likely more in the Helena office." The room was quiet. Outside, the evening had settled into full dark, and somewhere on the property, a horse shifted in its stall, and the ordinary nighttime sounds of the ranch continued, entirely unaware of the weight of what was sitting on this table. "3 families lost their land," Lillian said. "Yes," Elias said. "My family almost did." "Yes." She looked at the documents for a moment. Then she said, "We need a lawyer, not Fenn, someone who handles county cases. Someone who can take these records to a judge." "I have someone in mind," Elias said. "In Miles City. But to go to a judge, we need more than land transfer records. We need evidence that the debt manipulation was intentional, that the interest figures were altered specifically to force foreclosure." "Debt records," she said. "Harold would have them. Originals showing the actual agreed rates versus what he charged." "Locked in his office," Roy said. "His office in town?" she asked. "Above the lending house," Roy said. "He keeps everything there." She thought for a moment. Then she said, "My father has his original loan document, the one Harold gave him 4 years ago." Elias looked at her. Whatever the original document says, she continued, is what Harold agreed to charge. If his internal records show a different number, a higher number, that's evidence of intentional alteration. She paused. We don't need to break into his office. We just need someone who borrowed from him to have kept the original agreement. Your father kept his, Roy asked. My father kept everything, she said. He kept receipts from 18 years ago. He keeps his marriage certificate in the same box as his tool inventory list. She looked at Elias. He has the original note. Elias leaned back slightly. She watched him think, not performing the act of thinking, but actually doing it, which was a quality she found she respected more each time she saw it. If the original note shows a fixed rate, he said, and Harold's records show a moving rate, then Harold Whitaker has been committing fraud, she said, for years, against at least one documented borrower, and very likely many more. Roy Hatch looked at Elias. Elias looked at Lillian. You came here to warn me about a scheme, Elias said, and now you're sitting at my table building a legal case against the most powerful man in the county. I came here to tell the truth, she said. I'm still doing that. The case is just where the truth leads. Daniel Webb, who had been quiet through most of this, said, There's a federal land office inspector who comes through Billings every quarter. The next visit is in 6 weeks. If we had documented evidence of fraudulent land transfers through manufactured debt by that time, he'd have federal standing to investigate, Elias said. Not just county, Daniel said. Federal. Which means Harold's Helena connections don't protect him. The significance of that settled over the table. 6 weeks. It was a number. A real number with a real deadline attached to it. And deadlines, Lillian had learned, were the only thing that turned intentions into actions. Then we have 6 weeks, she said. She. Miss Rose. Elias said her name with something in it that was different from the way he'd said it in the yard that first morning. Something that had changed over the past days, without either of them commenting on it. You understand that if Harold realizes what we're doing before we're ready, he will act. He'll try to discredit us, she said. He'll try to destroy us, Elias corrected. There's a difference. She met his eyes. I know, she said. But he already tried to destroy my family once and he didn't finish it. I don't intend to give him a second chance. Roy picked up his coffee cup. I've been on this ranch 11 years, he said conversationally to no one in particular. In 11 years, I've seen the boss turn down 3 partnerships that would have made him considerably richer. 2 women who would have been considerable matches, and 1 offer from the governor's office. He took a sip. Never once seen him sit still for something because someone else talked sense into him. He looked at Lillian. Not until this week. Elias looked at Roy with an expression that communicated several things without saying any of them. Roy set his cup down. Just observing, he said. Keep observing to yourself, Elias said. Yes, sir. Lillian looked between them, and for the first time since arriving at Carter Ranch, she felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. The constant background awareness of being in a place where she didn't belong, performing a version of herself sturdy enough to hold up under judgment. In this room at this table with these people, she was not performing anything. She was simply herself. Which was, she was beginning to understand all she had ever needed to be. I'll go to my father tomorrow, she said. Get the original loan document. If he has it, and he does, I'll bring it back, and we'll compare it line by line against whatever your man can access from Harold's recorded filings. I can get the recorded filings, Daniel Webb said. They're public record. What they won't show is the private ledger, the internal one where Harold tracks actual charges versus agreed rates. We don't need the private ledger, Lillian said. We need the original agreement and the payment history. If the payment history shows he charged more than the original agreement, allows the math tells the story. Any judge can follow math. Elias was watching her again with that quality of attention she was still learning to read. You've thought about this before today, he said. I've watched my father try to understand why the debt kept growing when he kept paying, she said. I've asked that question for 3 years. I just didn't have the evidence to answer it. She paused. Now I think I do. The table fell quiet again. Daniel Webb began carefully stacking the documents into a folder. Roy moved to the window. Elias stayed still the way he stayed still when he was deciding something, not hesitating, but completing a calculation in his head before committing to it. "All right," he said finally. 2 words. But in the way he said them, settled final without reservation, they meant something larger than their size. "All right," Lillian said. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. Something had been agreed to in this room tonight that went beyond the water channel and the loan documents and the 6-week deadline. Something neither of them was quite ready to name yet, because naming it would require acknowledging how much had changed in the days since a farmer's daughter in a mended dress had stepped out of a borrowed buggy and refused to be what anyone expected her to be. She gathered her notes. Roy said goodnight and saw himself out. Daniel Webb took his folder and his ink-stained hands back toward town. Elias walked her to the door of the guest room May had quietly prepared on that first night, which no one had discussed, and no one had made a production of it, had simply appeared, made up and ready, because May understood situations that hadn't been spoken aloud. At the door, he stopped. "Miss Rose," he said. "One thing." She turned. "When this is over," he said, "when Harold is dealt with, and the farm is stable, and the channel is built." He paused. "Don't leave because you think you've completed what you came to do." She looked at him. "I came to warn you," she said. "That's all I planned on." "I know," he said. "Plans change." She held his gaze for a moment. This man who had surprised her every single day since she'd arrived, who noticed things other people overlooked and said true things without softening them, and treated her from the first moment in the yard like a person who was entirely capable of handling reality. "Good night, Mr. Carter," she said. "Good night, Miss Rose." She closed the door. In the room, in the dark, she stood still for a moment and let herself feel, not plan, not calculate, not prepare. Just feel the particular weight of a day that had shifted something she hadn't known was capable of shifting. Then she sat down, took out her mother's journal, and turned to a blank page near the back. She wrote one line. "Today I stopped being the girl they sent to be broken." Then she closed the journal, lay down in the clean-made bed, and for the first time in more than a week slept. Thomas Rose found the original loan document exactly where Lillian knew it would be, in the flat cedar box under his bed between his wife's death certificate and the deed to the farm wrapped in oilcloth, the way her mother had taught him to wrap anything that mattered. He handed it to Lillian without asking why she needed it again. He had asked once the day before, and she had told him the truth, that she believed Harold Whitaker had been charging more than the original agreement allowed, and that she was going to prove it. He had sat with that for a long time, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and then he had said, "Your mother would have done the same thing." Which was the highest compliment Thomas Rose knew how to give. She rode back to Carter Ranch with the document inside her coat close against her chest, which was not sentimentality, but practicality. Paper was fragile, and the weather had turned cold, and there were things in the world worth protecting from damage. Elias was waiting at the table with Daniel Webb and a third set of documents. The recorded payment histories. Harold Whitaker had filed with the county clerk's office over the past 4 years. These were public records technically available to anyone, but practically invisible because nobody thought to look at them, which was exactly the kind of invisibility Harold depended on. They spread everything across the table and started comparing. It took less than 20 minutes. The original loan document showed a fixed annual interest rate of 8%, which was standard for agricultural lending in 1887. The recorded payment histories showed that Thomas Rose had been charged between 11 and 14% in different quarters, the figure moving in a range that looked, if you weren't examining it carefully, like normal market adjustment. But there was no market adjustment clause in the original document. There was no adjustment clause at all. The rate was fixed, 8%. Written clearly in Harold Whitaker's own lending office letterhead, signed by Harold Whitaker's own clerk. Daniel Webb set his pen down and looked at the 2 documents side by side. "That's fraud," he said. It was not a complicated legal analysis. It was simply a man reading 2 pieces of paper and identifying that they said different things about the same agreement. "It's provable fraud," Elias said. "Against one borrower with documentation. We need to determine how many others." The 3 North Farms, Lillian said. They won't have their documents anymore if Harold foreclosed on them. The paperwork went with the property. But they'll remember what they agreed to. Memory isn't evidence, Elias said. Memory combined with a pattern is the beginning of evidence, she said. And if we can get even one more original document. Grayson Holt, Roy said from across the room. Everyone looked at him. He shrugged. North of the Henderson spread. Harold lent him money 2 years ago. Grayson told me about it at the cattle auction last fall, said the terms were unusually good. I remember thinking it seemed too clean for Harold. If the terms were good on paper and worse in practice, Lillian said, Grayson Holt is exactly who we need. Elias looked at Roy. Roy was already reaching for his hat. I'll ride out this morning, Roy said. Back by noon if he's home. He was back by 11:30. He set a folded document on the table, worn at the creases, slightly water-stained at one corner, but intact and legible. Grayson Holt's original loan agreement showed a fixed rate of 7.5%. Daniel Webb pulled Grayson Holt's recorded payment history from his folder. He found it in 40 seconds. He set it beside the original. The charged rate ranged from 10 to 13%. Nobody spoke for a moment. 2 borrowers, Elias said. 2 documented cases of deliberate rate alteration. 6 weeks, Lillian said quietly. 5.5 now, Daniel Webb said. The first sign that Harold Whitaker knew something was wrong came 4 days later, and it did not come from Harold himself. It came from Margaret Alcott. Margaret Alcott was the wife of the town's dry goods merchant, a woman who had lived in Red Hollow her entire life, and who operated as the county's primary social architect, the person who decided through the careful management of invitations and exclusions who was welcome where and on what terms. She was not cruel in the obvious way. She was precise, which was considerably more effective. She arrived at Carter Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, which told Lillian immediately that this was not a casual social call. Nobody rode 3 miles on a Wednesday afternoon in October, unless the visit had a specific purpose. May announced her with the tone of voice that indicated she had already formed an opinion. Lillian came into the front room to find Margaret Alcott standing with the particular posture of a woman who had appointed herself to an important task and intended to complete it efficiently. "Miss Rose," she said, "I hoped we might speak privately." "Of course," Lillian said. She did not offer tea. She waited. Margaret looked around the room once, not admiring it, cataloging it, and then settled her attention on Lillian with the focused consideration of someone delivering a prepared message. "I want to speak plainly," Margaret said. "Please do." "There is concern in town," she said, "about your presence here, about what it means for Mr. Carter's reputation and for yours." She paused. "An unmarried young woman staying at a widower's property, people talk. People talk regardless," Lillian said. "I've noticed that. They talk more when there is something to talk about." "Mrs. Alcott." Lillian kept her voice even. "I am here as part of a commercial arrangement to restore my family's farm. The terms are documented and legal. Mr. Carter's lawyer drew them up. My father has signed them." She paused. "What specifically are people concerned about?" Margaret's expression shifted just slightly, the way expressions shifted when the conversation didn't go the direction that was prepared for. "It's not appropriate for a young woman to be living in a man's home without family present," she said, "whatever the business arrangement." "May is here," Lillian said. "She has been here for 11 years. She manages this household. I don't believe my presence is less appropriate than it would be at any legitimate place of employment. This is not a place of employment." "I review accounts and manage supply coordination," Lillian said. "If a man from town were doing the same work, you would call it employment." She met Margaret's eyes. "The only thing that makes it something else is that I'm a woman." The silence that followed had edges. Margaret adjusted her gloves. It was a small gesture, but it was the gesture of a woman recalibrating, deciding how much further to push and in which direction. "Harold Whitaker," she said finally, "is concerned about you." There it was. Lillian felt the shape of it click into place. Margaret Alcott had not arrived at Carter Ranch because the town was genuinely concerned about propriety. She had arrived because Harold Whitaker was concerned about what Lillian was doing here, and Harold had sent the most socially influential woman in Red Hollow to find out and, if possible, to apply enough pressure to remove her. "Is he?" Lillian said. "He feels responsible," Margaret said. "Having arranged the introduction, he didn't arrange an introduction," Lillian said. Her voice was still calm. She had promised herself sometime in the past week that she would not lose her temper with Harold Whitaker's messengers, because losing her temper was exactly what Harold was hoping she would do. Anger made people sloppy. Anger made people say things that could be reframed. She intended to be perfectly precise and permanently calm in every public exchange until this was finished. "Mr. Whitaker approached my family while we were financially vulnerable and offered to forgive a debt in exchange for my compliance with a scheme he constructed to embarrass Elias Carter. I chose to come here and tell Mr. Carter the truth instead. That is the full story." Margaret stared at her. "I'm telling you this plainly," Lillian continued, "because you said you wanted plain speaking, and I intend to take you at your word. If Harold Whitaker is concerned about my presence here, you can tell him he should be." She stood. "Can I offer you anything before you go? Mrs. Alcott makes excellent cornbread." Margaret Alcott left 12 minutes later without the cornbread and without the information she'd come for, from the doorway of the study. Elias watched her buggy pull away. "You told her everything," he said. "I told her the true version," Lillian said, before Harold could solidify the false one. She turned. "Is that a problem?" He considered for a moment. "No," he said. "But Harold will know within the hour." "Good," she said. "Let him spend some time thinking about what we're doing instead of what he's doing." Harold Whitaker did not come himself. He sent a letter. It arrived at Carter Ranch the following morning, addressed to Elias, written in Harold's careful, businesslike hand on his lending office letterhead. Elias read it at the breakfast table and then passed it across to Lillian without comment. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph expressed concern for Lillian's welfare and her family's stability. The second paragraph suggested obliquely but unmistakably that Elias's commercial relationship with the Rose farm might constitute an inappropriate use of his resources and influence. The third paragraph noted that Harold had significant goodwill in the county and would hate to see misunderstandings damage anyone's reputation. It was in the specific grammar of men, like Harold Whitaker, a threat. Lillian read it twice. Then she set it down. "He's scared," she said. Elias looked at her. "Not of us specifically," she said. "He doesn't know yet what we have. He's scared because Margaret Alcott came back and told him what I said, and now he knows I'm not confused about what happened. He knows I understand his scheme." She tapped the letter. "This is a warning to back off before we find something." "Which means he believes there's something to find," Elias said. "Which means there is," she said. Roy came in from outside, stomping cold from his boots, and picked up the letter from the table without asking. He read it, set it down, and said, "He calls that subtle." "He's used to people being scared of him," Elias said. "Subtlety matters less when fear does all the work." "Are you scared?" Roy asked Elias. "No," Elias said. Roy looked at Lillian. "I'm angry," she said. "Which is more useful?" May set biscuits on the table. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Elias picked up a biscuit and said, "Daniel Webb is riding to Billings tomorrow. There's a land records office there with filings that aren't in the county system, older transfers, some of them predating Harold's current operation. If Harold has been running this longer than 5 years, the earlier records would be there." "How long will it take?" Lillian asked. 3 days there and back," he said. "He'll send word by telegraph if he finds anything significant." 3 days. She did the math in her head. 4.5 weeks to the federal inspector's visit. 3 days for Daniel. Time enough if the records existed to build what they needed. "There's something else," Roy said. He pulled a chair out and sat down, which was unusual. Roy generally delivered information standing, as if sitting down would slow the delivery. The fact that he sat meant what was coming needed to be heard carefully. I rode into town yesterday evening, stopped at the feed store. He paused. Harold is telling people the Channel Project is proof that Elias Carter is trying to acquire the Rose farm. That he's using the debt situation to get his hands on it cheap. The room went very quiet. It was Lillian recognized immediately the most elegant move Harold had made yet, because it took the one genuinely good thing happening in this situation and reframed it as predatory. It took Elias's legitimate help and turned it into evidence of the very behavior Harold himself was guilty of. And it put Elias in the position of either explaining himself, which looked defensive, or staying silent, which looked like confirmation. "Who's listening to him?" Elias asked. "Enough people," Roy said. "The Carver brothers, old Pemberton, some of the newer families who don't know your history well enough to weigh it properly." Elias set his biscuit down. Lillian was already thinking. She could see the trap Harold had built, and she could see with the particular spatial clarity that came from having watched too many things go wrong exactly where it would close if they didn't act. "We need Thomas Rose to speak," she said. Both men looked at her. "In public," she said. "At the town meeting next week, it's the first Thursday of the month. They hold it at the Grange Hall. My father stands up and tells people what the actual terms of the Carter loan are. Not what Harold says they are. What they actually are." She looked at Elias. "Can I take him a copy of the agreement?" "It's his agreement," Elias said. "He already has a copy. He needs to be willing to read it aloud in public," she said. "In front of Harold Whitaker." Her father, who had spent 30 years being quietly, steadily honest, who had never sought attention or confrontation in his life, who had lost a great deal in the past 4 years, and who was still, she knew, carrying the particular shame of a man who believed he should have protected his family better than he had. She was asking him to stand in a public room and call a powerful man a liar. "I'll talk to him," she said. "He'll do it." Roy said, "You sure about that?" "He did it for 30 years when no one was watching," she said. "Doing it once when someone is watching is the easier version." She rode to the farm that afternoon. Her father was in the north field working on the fencing that had needed repair since summer. He looked up when he heard her horse and waited while she dismounted. "You have that look," he said. "What look?" "Your mother's look," he said. "The one that means you've already decided what needs to happen, and you're coming to tell me what it is." She almost smiled. "I need you to speak at the town meeting Thursday." Howe was quiet for a moment. He pulled his work gloves off one finger at a time. "About Harold." "About the loan terms," she said. "About what Carter Ranch is actually doing and why. Harold is telling people in town that Elias is trying to take the farm. You're the one who can say that's not true. My word against Harold Whitaker's." "Your word with a signed legal document," she said, "in front of witnesses." Howe was quiet for a long time. She waited. She had learned growing up with him that Thomas Rose's silences were not emptiness. They were the sound of a thorough man being thorough. "I've known Harold Whitaker for 20 years, he said finally. "I voted for the men he supported. I did business at his supply house. I thought he was not a friend, but a neighbor. Someone who operated by the same rules as everyone else." He looked at the fence line. "Finding out a man isn't what you believed he was doesn't just make you angry. It makes you feel foolish." "You're not foolish," she said. "He was careful. He's been careful for 20 years. I should have looked more closely." "Daddy." She stepped closer. "Harold Whitaker built a system specifically designed to make good people not look closely. He counted on you being exactly who you are, honest, trusting. Working too hard to have time to check his math." She paused. "The fact that you didn't catch it isn't a failure of your intelligence. It's evidence of how long he planned this." Her father looked at her for a moment. And then he did something she had not seen him do in years. His eyes went bright at the edges, the particular brightness of a man who was not going to cry, but who was feeling something large enough that his body needed somewhere to put it. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he said. She took a breath. "Thursday," she said. "I'll be there." "I'll be there," he said. Thursday came with cold, clean air and a sky so clear it felt aggressive. The Grange Hall in Red Hollow held, perhaps 60 people, when full. That Thursday evening, it held 73, which told Lillian that word had spread. Harold's version of events had done exactly what Harold intended it to do, stirring up enough concern and curiosity that people who normally skipped the monthly meeting had decided to attend. Harold was there naturally. He arrived early and took a seat near the front where he could be seen and could see. He was flanked by two of his associates' men who worked in his supply business and who functioned in situations like this as visual confirmation that Harold Whitaker was a man of substance and standing. Elias arrived with Roy. They took seats near the back, which Lillian thought was the right choice, not positioning himself at the center, not making this about his presence. Making it about the truth, which could speak from anywhere in the room. Lillian sat beside her father in the middle. The meeting began with routine business road maintenance, a water rights discussion about a creek crossing on the Eastern County Road, a report from the school board. Harold sat through all of it with the patience of a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the ceremony to catch up. When the floor opened for general matters, Harold stood immediately. I had a gift for speaking. Lillian had to acknowledge that the man knew how to fill a room with his voice, how to land pauses in the right places, how to project concern while delivering a weapon. Friends, he said, I want to address something that's been troubling me, and I believe is troubling many of you. He glanced around the room with the expression of a man who cared deeply. As you know, I worked hard to connect the Rose family with an opportunity at Carter Ranch. I did this out of genuine concern for a family in need. He shook his head slightly. What I've since learned troubles me deeply. It appears the commercial arrangement Mr. Carter put before Thomas Rose may not be as straightforward as it seemed. Water rights agreements, fixed loan terms. These are complicated instruments. I'm concerned that a family in a vulnerable position may not have fully understood what they were agreeing to. A murmur went through the room. Harold sat down with the expression of a man who had said a difficult thing because it needed to be said. Thomas Rose stood up. He did not do it loudly or dramatically. He simply stood the way he did everything, without performance, without hesitation, with the complete physical steadiness of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it. Mr. Whitaker, he said. His voice carried to every corner of the room without him raising it. I'd like to respond to that if you don't mind. Harold spread his hands graciously. Of course, Thomas. Thomas Rose reached into his coat and produced two documents. He held them up so the room could see them. This, he said, holding up the first, is the original loan agreement Mr. Whitaker's office gave me 4 years ago. Fixed rate of 8%. My signature. His clerk's signature. He held up the second. This is the payment record from the county clerk's office showing what his office actually charged me. He paused. The rate moves between 11 and 14%. Every quarter. For 4 years. He looked at Harold. I'd like to know what instrument explains that difference, Harold. Because it's not in the original agreement. I've read it several times. 63 people turned to look at Harold Whitaker. Harold's expression did not collapse. He was too practiced for that. But something in it recalibrated visibly, a fractional shift, like a weight-bearing wall, developing a crack too small to see, but large enough to feel. Thomas, he said carefully. There are adjustment provisions in the standard lending agreement that— There are no adjustment provisions in the document I signed, Thomas said. I have the document. It's right here. Anyone who wants to read it is welcome to. He set it on the empty chair beside him. Anyone. Nobody moved for a moment. Then old Pemberton, who had been sitting 3 rows back with his arms crossed, leaned forward and said, I'd like to read it. He was not the only one. What happened next took approximately 12 minutes, and in those 12 minutes, the social architecture of Red Hollow, Montana shifted in a way that would not fully reverse. 4 men read the original document. 3 of them asked to see the payment record beside it. One of them, Gerald Carver, the older of the Carver brothers, sat back in his chair at the end of those 12 minutes and looked at Harold Whitaker with an expression that was not anger, but was the precursor to anger, the moment of recognition before the feeling fully arrives. Harold, Gerald Carver said, I borrowed from you 3 years ago. Gerald. My original rate was 8%, Gerald said. Fixed. I have the agreement at home. Market conditions. Is the rate in my agreement fixed or not? Gerald said. His voice was quiet and absolutely flat. Yes or no? Harold Whitaker, for the first time in Lillian's experience of him, did not immediately have an answer. Elias Carter stood up from the back of the room. I didn't say anything right away. He simply stood and the room turned to him, because when Elias Carter stood in a room, the room paid attention, not from fear, but from the instinctive recognition that what this man said when he chose to speak would be worth hearing. I want to say something about the Rose Farm arrangement, he said, directly, so there's no confusion. He looked at the room, not at Harold. Thomas Rose and I have a written loan agreement at a fixed rate of 5% below market because the land is good land that will produce once it has water. The water channel being built now will connect Rose Farmland to Crow Creek access through a water rights agreement Thomas and I both signed. The terms are public record with the county clerk. He paused. Anyone who wants to read those documents is welcome to come to my ranch at any time. The door will be open. He sat back down. The room was quiet in the particular way rooms went quiet when something had just been clarified that could not be unclarified. Harold stood again. I think we should all take a breath here. These are complicated matters and... Harold. It was Margaret Alcott who spoke. The same Margaret Alcott who had ridden to Carter Ranch to deliver Harold's warning. She spoke from 3 seats to Harold's left, and she spoke in the measured tone of a woman who had spent considerable time between Wednesday and Thursday, reconsidering what she had been asked to do and why. I think Thomas Rose deserves a direct answer to his direct question. What explains the difference between the agreed rate and the charged rate? Harold looked at her. Margaret looked back. She had the particular expression of a woman who had been used as a messenger and was currently deciding what she thought about that. Harold said, "These things require professional review. A county meeting is not the appropriate venue." Then what is the appropriate venue? Thomas Rose said. Harold did not answer. He sat down instead, which was in Lillian's reading of the room, the single most damaging thing he could have done, because sitting down when a room was waiting for your answer was as loud as any confession. Lillian had not spoken once during the entire meeting. She had sat beside her father and watched the truth do the work she'd always believed it could do, if it was given the right room and the right moment and the right person willing to stand up and say it plainly. Her father reached over and put his hand briefly on her arm. One brief moment of contact, then he took it away because he was Thomas Rose, and large emotions were expressed in small gestures. It was enough. After the meeting, as people filed out in clusters of 2s and 3s, talking in the lowered voices of those processing something significant, Elias came through the crowd to where Lillian was standing. I didn't say anything immediately. He stood beside her and watched the room empty. Watched Harold Whitaker leave with his 2 associates without speaking to anyone. Watched Gerald Carver approach Thomas Rose and shake his hand with the solemn grip of a man who had just realized they shared something important. Your father, Elias said finally. Yes, she said. He's something. He always has been, she said. The town just hadn't seen it before. Elias glanced at her. Daniel Webb sent word from Billings this morning, he said. Before the meeting. I didn't want to say until we were through. She turned to look at him. He found records going back 7 years, Elias said. 11 borrowers, 11 original agreements, all with fixed rates, all with payment histories that don't match. He paused. And one more thing. She waited. There's a land holding company registered in Helena, he said. It owns 4 properties in this county. 3 of them are the North Farms that foreclosed. He paused. The 4th property is registered under the name of a woman named Clara Whitaker. Harold's wife, she asked. His sister, he said. She died 2 years ago. The property registered in her name was never transferred out of her estate, which means Harold has been collecting income from a property that legally belongs to her estate, an estate that has beneficiaries who are not Harold. He looked at Lillian steadily. He's been stealing from his own family's trust. The magnitude of that settled over her. It was not just fraud against borrowers. It was fraud against a dead woman's estate, against people who trusted him personally, not commercially. The federal inspector, she said. 4 weeks and 3 days, Elias said. She looked at the now empty hall. Her father was near the door talking with Gerald Carver, and the two of them were comparing documents with the careful attention of men who had just discovered they were asking the same question. "Harold knows tonight changed something," she said. "Yes," Elias said. "He'll move faster now," she said. "He'll try to do something before we're ready." "I know." "What does he have left?" she said. "What can he actually do at this point?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "He can try to discredit us," he said. "Or he can try to destroy the evidence." He paused. "Or he can try to remove the people who have it." The word remove sat in the air between them. She looked at him. "You mean threaten us?" "I mean he has options that go beyond letters and social pressure," he said. "Men like Harold, when they feel the walls closing, they don't always choose the legal option." She absorbed that without looking away. "Are you telling me to be careful?" "I'm telling you to be aware," he said. "There's a difference." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." They stood together in the nearly empty hall for a moment. This man who had seen her from the first moment for what she actually was, and this woman who had arrived as someone else's weapon and refused to be one, and between them the particular wait of 4 weeks and 3 days, and everything that still had to happen before this was finished. "Tomorrow," she said, "I want to sit with the Billings records when Daniel gets back." "He'll be back by Saturday," Elias said. "Good," she said. "Then Saturday we work." She walked to her father and took his arm, and the three of them, Lillian Thomas and the slow-building truth they had spent the evening setting loose in Red Hollow, walked out into the cold Montana night together. Behind them, somewhere in town, Harold Whitaker was sitting with the knowledge that tonight had not gone the way he planned and deciding what to do next. That decision Lillian knew would come fast. She intended to be ready. Daniel Webb arrived back from Billings on Saturday morning, looking like a man who had not slept in 3 days, which was because he had not slept in 3 days. He came through the door of Carter Ranch with his saddlebag over one shoulder and a leather case under his other arm that he set on the table with the particular care of someone carrying something breakable. Then he sat down, accepted the coffee May put in front of him without comment, and opened the case. 11 borrowers, he said. "I confirmed all 11. Original agreements, all with fixed rates. Payment records showing rates that don't match." He pulled a bound sheaf of copied documents from the case. "But that's not the most important thing I found." Elias sat across from him. Lillian sat to his left. Roy stood near the wall with his arms folded. "There's a ledger," Daniel said. "Not the official payment records, a private ledger. Harold files it at the Helena Land Office as a business operations record. It's registered as internal accounting, which means it's technically accessible as a corporate filing, but nobody ever looks at corporate filings from a small county lending operation." He set a hand on the copied pages. "I looked." "What's in it?" Lillian asked. "Everything," Daniel said. "Borrower names, original agreed rates, rates actually charged. The difference column, he calls it adjustment revenue. The total adjustment revenue across all 11 borrowers over 7 years is..." He found the page and turned it to face them. $41,000. Nobody spoke. $41,000. In 1887, in Cutter County, Montana, that number was not just money. It was the combined value of everything those 11 families had spent their lives building. It was a number so large it almost refused to be real, and yet there it was in Harold Whitaker's own handwriting, labeled in his own careful columns, because Harold had kept meticulous records of everything he'd taken, because he needed to know exactly how much he had and where it was. He kept records of the fraud, Roy said. He sounded almost admiring in the way people sometimes sounded when confronted with the sheer audacity of a thing. He kept records of everything, Daniel said. He needed to. You can't run an operation this size without tracking it. He looked at Elias. But it also means we have his handwriting on documents that prove intent. This wasn't sloppy accounting. He labeled the column. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he tracked it like any other revenue stream. "That's not adjustment revenue," Lillian said. She was looking at the copied page. "That's a confession. With the federal inspector in..." Elias looked at her. 23 days, she said. She had been counting every morning. With the federal inspector in 23 days. Elias continued. We take this to Miles City first, the county circuit judge. We file for a fraud injunction freeze Harold's ability to transfer assets or call in any outstanding loans until the federal review is complete. He looked at Daniel. Can Fenn handle the filing? Fenn can start it, Daniel said. But for federal fraud at this scale, you need someone from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I have a contact in Helena, a man named Corbett. He's handled land fraud cases in Wyoming Territory. He knows the pattern. Telegraph him today, Elias said. Already drafted the message, Daniel said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet. I wrote it on the train back. Just need to send it. Elias looked at Daniel with the expression of a man reassessing someone upward. Send it. Daniel stood, took his coffee with him, and was gone. Roy pushed off from the wall. Harold had 2 days since the town meeting to think about his next move, he said. That's enough time for a man like him to do something. What would you do? Elias asked him. In his position, Roy thought for a moment. I'd go after the weakest point, he said. The thing that holds the case together that could still be broken. He looked at Lillian without meaning to, then looked away. She had already thought the same thing. My father, she said. The original loan document, Roy said. Without it, the case is Daniel's copies against Harold's claims. With it, it's original evidence. Harold can't take the document, Elias said. It's Thomas's property. He doesn't have to take it, Lillian said. Her voice had gone quiet in the way it went quiet when she was thinking fast. He just has to convince my father not to use it, or convince him that using it will hurt him somehow. She stood. I need to go to the farm. I'll ride with you, Elias said. You don't? I'll ride with you, he said again, without the opening for argument. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. They rode fast, and mostly without talking, which was a quality she had come to appreciate about being around him. He didn't fill silence with noise, just to have something to fill it with. The road from Carter Ranch to the Rose Farm was 3 miles of rutted track that her horse knew by feel at this point, and they covered it in under 20 minutes. Her father was in the yard when they arrived. He was not alone. A man she didn't recognize was standing beside the fence, city clothes, not a rancher, not a laborer. I was holding his hat in both hands and speaking to Thomas Rose with the careful tone of someone delivering a formal message. Lillian was off her horse before it had fully stopped. Daddy. Thomas Rose looked up. Something moved across his face relief, she thought, and underneath the relief, something more complicated. The man in the city clothes turned. He had a leather document case under his arm and the expression of a professional who had been asked to do a job and was doing it. Miss Rose, he said, I'm Arthur Crane. I represent Mr. Harold Whitaker's legal interests. She looked at her father. What did he offer you? Thomas Rose took a breath. He says he'll extend the original debt forgiveness to cover the loan with Carter Ranch as well. He says we'd own the farm free and clear, no liens, no commercial arrangements with anyone. He paused. All we have to do is confirm that the original loan document was lost in the drought damage to the barn 2 years ago and isn't available for review. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Harold was offering them everything. The farm, the debt, total financial freedom in exchange for the one piece of paper that made his entire scheme provable. Arthur Crane said carefully, It's a genuinely generous offer, Miss Rose. Mr. Whitaker wants only to resolve these misunderstandings without further— How much is he paying you? She asked. Crane blinked. I beg your pardon. You're a lawyer from Helena, she said. You rode out here personally to make this offer instead of sending a letter. That means Harold needed someone credible to deliver it, someone whose professional presence would make it feel legitimate. She looked at him directly. I'm asking how much he's paying you because I want you to understand that whatever it is, it's coming from money he stole from 11 families in this county. I thought you should know that before you continue. Crane was quiet for the moment. He was a professional. He did not show what he was thinking. But she noticed he did not immediately speak. The offer stands regardless, he said finally. Mr. Whitaker. The document isn't lost, Thomas Rose said. Crane stopped. It's in the cedar box under my bed, Thomas said. Where it's been since the day Harold's clerk handed it to me. And it's going to stay there until I hand it to a judge." He looked at Crane with the steady, undecorated expression of a man who had made a decision and was finished making it. "You can tell Harold that." Crane looked between the two of them. He recalibrated silently. Then he put his hat on, picked up his case, and said, "Good day, Miss Rose, Mr. Rose." He walked to his horse. Elias had not moved or spoken since they arrived. He stood slightly behind Lillian, a presence she was aware of. The way you were aware of solid ground under your feet, not thinking about it, but relying on it without needing to acknowledge it. When Crane was gone, Thomas Rose let out a long breath that had clearly been held for some time. "He came an hour ago," he said. "I stalled him until you got here." "How did you know we'd come?" Lillian asked. He looked at her with the mild expression of a father who had been watching his child think for 22 years. "Because you're always 3 steps ahead," he said. "I figured you were already on your way." Elias said, "Mr. Rose, I'd like to suggest you come to the ranch for the next few weeks. You and the document both." Thomas looked at him. "You think he'll try something else?" "He just showed us what he values most," Elias said. "Which means he'll try again for it." Thomas considered this. He was not a man who liked accepting help. She knew that, had grown up watching him refuse it, even when refusing cost him. But he was also a man who had learned in the past several weeks the difference between pride that served you and pride that got in your way. "I'll pack a bag," he said. The telegram from U.S. Attorney Corbett arrived on Tuesday. It was 8 words: "Case merits federal review." Arriving Billings, October 28th. October 28th was 19 days away, which was 4 days before the federal inspector's scheduled visit, meaning Corbett intended to be on the ground first to have the documentation reviewed and the case framed before the inspector arrived. Which meant he was taking this seriously. Which meant Daniel Webb's telegram had described something that looked, even from Helena, like something real. Lillian read the telegram and looked at Elias. 19 days, she said. 19 days, he said. "Harold will find out about Corbett," she said. "Word travels." "It already has, probably," he said. Daniel sent the telegram from the Miles City office. The operator knows Harold. She felt the situation tightening the way it tightened before things broke open. Every piece was moving toward the same point, and the closer they got to that point, the more Harold would feel it, and the less predictable he would become. "Roy," she said. Roy looked up from across the room. "What's Harold's relationship with the county sheriff?" she asked. Roy and Elias exchanged a look, the compressed, information-dense look of 2 people who had worked together for 11 years. "Complicated," Roy said. "How complicated?" "Sheriff Briggs has accepted donations from Harold's Civic Fund for the past 4 years, Elias said. "He's not corrupt in a simple way, but he's indebted in the way that makes men want to look in directions they're pointed." "Could Harold use him to delay a federal filing?" she asked. "At the county level temporarily," Elias said. "Not at the federal level. Briggs has no jurisdiction over what Corbett does. But he could delay long enough to cause problems," she said. "If Harold convinced Briggs to open some kind of local investigation into the Carter Ranch operations, anything, even something frivolous, it creates confusion. It gives Harold a counter-narrative." She thought for a moment. "We need to file at the circuit court before Harold can maneuver. The fraud injunction has started it." "He filed the initial paperwork Monday," Elias said. "The circuit judge is scheduled to review it Thursday." 2 days, she said. 2 days, he confirmed. She looked at the telegram again. 19 days and 2 separate legal processes, moving simultaneously. The circuit court injunction and the federal review, and Harold Whitaker, somewhere in between them, deciding what a man decided when he felt the machinery closing around him. What she did not anticipate was where Harold's next move would come from. She should have. She thought about it later and understood precisely where she had been looking in the wrong direction. She had been watching for legal maneuvers, for official pressure, for the kind of tactics a man used when he operated inside systems. She had not been watching for the thing Harold did when systems stopped serving him. It came on Wednesday evening. Roy came back from the western pasture, where the digging crew was finishing the last section of the water channel, a job that would be done by the end of the week ahead of schedule, and his expression was the specific expression of a man carrying news he wished he wasn't carrying. "The Harmon crew," he said. "The 2 men we hired from the Harmon spread to help with the channel." "What about them?" Elias said. "They quit this afternoon, packed up and left. Ed Harmon rode over to tell me himself, said Harold Whitaker visited him this morning and told him that any man who worked on the Carter Water Project would find Harold's supply house closed to them." Roy paused. "Harold supplies 70% of the Harmon operations feed and equipment needs. Ed said he had no choice." The room was quiet. It was a precise move. Not illegal, not loud. Simply the application of economic pressure to the most vulnerable point, the people who depended on Harold's supply network and couldn't afford to lose it. "How many other operations does Harold supply?" Lillian asked. 8 ranches in the county," Roy said. "Varying degrees of dependence." "He's going to apply this to all of them," she said. "Anyone connected to us, anyone who's spoken in our favor." She looked at Elias. "The channel crew. 4 of our own men," Roy said. "He can't threaten them. They work for us." 4 is enough finish, Elias said. "The channel will be done Friday." "And then," Roy said. "And then the water runs," Lillian said. "Once the water is running to the Rose farm, that part is done. Harold can't undig a channel." She was right about that. But she felt it the way Harold was contracting the space around them, pulling in the resources and relationships he controlled, making the world a degree smaller each day. He could not stop the legal case. He could not take the document from Thomas. He could not prevent the federal review. But he could make the county cost something. Make every person who stood beside them pay a price in supply access, or social standing, or small daily friction that added up over time. "He's trying to exhaust us," she said. "Not beat us, exhaust us." Elias looked at her. "If enough people around us feel enough pressure," she said. "Eventually someone pulls back. Someone stops helping. Someone decides the cost is too high." She paused. "He doesn't need to win the legal case. He just needs enough people to step away that when the case goes forward, we're standing there with less support than we had." "Is it working?" Roy asked. She thought honestly about that. About the Harmon crew leaving. About the people in town who had been warm after the meeting and might now find themselves reconsidering. About the small, invisible daily pressure that Harold could apply to anyone who looked like they were choosing a side. "Not yet," she said. "But it will start to." "Then we give people something that costs them less than staying away," Elias said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Harold's supply house," he said. "He supplies 8 operations in this county. Feed equipment seed." He paused. "I have the resources to establish a supply cooperative. County run. Fair pricing. No individual leverage points for anyone to exploit." He said it the way he said all his large ideas, plainly without drama, as if he'd been thinking about it for some time and had simply arrived at the moment to say it. She stared at him. "You're going to build a supply cooperative. I'm going to help build one," he said. "The county builds it. I provide the initial capital and the warehouse space." He looked at her. "You write up the organizational structure." "Me?" "You understand how people in this county operate," he said. "You understand what they need and what they're afraid of. You know which families are which and how they relate to each other." He met her eyes. "I know land and capital. You know people. Together, that's what this needs." She looked at him for a moment. This man who kept doing the thing she didn't anticipate, who kept seeing her for a different use than anyone else had ever imagined, who kept offering her not charity, but a seat at the table where the actual decisions were made. "All right," she said. "I'll need 2 days to draft it." "You'll have them," he said. Roy said to the wall, "I've been on this ranch 11 years. "Roy," Elias said. "Just noting the time," Roy said. She wrote the cooperative structure in 1 day instead of 2. It was not because she was in a hurry, though she was. It was because the thing had been forming in her head for years without her knowing it. Every observation she'd made of how her neighbors operated, who helped whom, which families had skills the others needed. How the informal economy of a small county actually functioned beneath the surface of the official one. She had been collecting that knowledge her whole life, without a name for what she was collecting it for. Now, she had a name. She wrote for 10 hours, barely stopping. Thomas Rose sat at the other end of the table and read each page as she finished it, and twice he put his hand flat on a paragraph and said, "This is exactly right," in the tone he used for things that were exactly right. When Elias read it Thursday morning, he was quiet for a long time. "You included a provision for drought year credit extensions," he said. "Every family in this county has had at least one drought year in the past decade," she said. "A supply cooperative that calls in debts during a drought is the same as Harold Whitaker, just with better branding. And a rotating board of directors. So no single person controls it," she said. "Including you." He looked up from the document. "Including me?" "Yes," she said. "You're the founding capital. You don't get permanent control. Those are different things." He looked at her for a moment. "You know," he said, "most people who needed something from me as much as you do would not be this particular about limiting my authority. Most people who needed something from you didn't have 2 sleepless nights to think about what they were walking into," she said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the warmth that existed in the space just before one. "Fair," he said. The circuit court injunction came through on Thursday afternoon. Judge Heller, reviewing Fenn's filing in Miles City, signed a temporary injunction freezing Harold Whitaker's ability to transfer any property or call in any outstanding loans in Cutter County pending review of fraud allegations. The injunction was legally required to be served to Harold directly, which Sheriff Briggs was legally required to do regardless of his complicated relationship with Harold's civic fund. Roy brought the news back from town at 4 o'clock. "Briggs served it himself," Roy said. "Didn't look happy about it, but he did it." "How did Harold take it?" Elias asked. "Briggs said Harold read it twice," Roy said. "Then he asked Briggs if there was anything that could be done at the county level to delay federal review." He paused. Briggs told him no. "Good man," Lillian said quietly. "Briggs told Harold something else," Roy said. He looked at Lillian. "He told Harold that Miss Rose had more friends in this county than Harold had apparently noticed." She didn't respond to that, but she felt it, the particular warmth of being seen clearly by someone unexpected. That evening, as the light went thin and cold through the windows of Carter Ranch, Lillian sat at the table with her mother's journal open in front of her, not writing, just sitting with it, her hand resting on the page where she'd written that one line 3 weeks ago. "Today I stopped being the girl they sent to be broken." She turned to a new blank page. She wrote, "Today the channel finished. The water runs to the south field." She wrote 19 days became 16. 16 is a number I can see the end of. She stopped. She looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote one more line. "I don't know exactly what I am here yet, but I know I'm here. Not as a weapon, not as a debt payment, not as someone else's plan. Here is myself, which is the only way I've ever wanted to be anywhere." She closed the journal. From the next room she could hear Thomas Rose and Elias Carter talking, her father's voice and Elias's voice in the particular register of 2 men who had stopped being careful with each other and started simply speaking. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't try to. Whatever was being said in that room was its own conversation, its own thing, building in its own time. She sat quietly for a moment and let herself feel the truth of where she was. She had arrived at this ranch with a suitcase, a warning, and the stubborn conviction that truth was worth telling, even when the room it was told in wasn't ready to hear it. She had arrived as a girl everyone in Red Hollow considered worth nothing, sent here to serve a purpose she'd refused to serve. 16 days. 16 days until Corbett arrived from Helena. 16 days until the case went from something they were building to something that existed in the official world, where Harold Whitaker could no longer simply ignore it, or outlast it, or pressure it into silence. She did not think about what came after that. Not yet. One thing at a time. One day at a time. One true thing told in one honest room to one person willing to hear it. That was all it had ever taken. She was beginning to understand all it would ever take. She got up from the table, left her journal where it was, and walked toward the sound of the two voices in the next room. She knocked once briefly and opened the door. Both men looked up. "I thought of something for the cooperative structure," she said. "A provision for shared equipment between neighboring farms during planting season. It would reduce Harold's leverage on the equipment supply side considerably." Thomas Rose said, "Sit down, Lily." Elias pulled out the nearest chair. She sat down and told them what she'd thought of, and the three of them worked until the fire needed tending, and Thomas Rose got up to tend it, and Elias refilled all 3 coffee cups without asking. And the night outside went full dark, and the county went quiet around them. And in 16 days, everything Harold Whitaker had built on the suffering of other people was going to be laid out in a federal courtroom for exactly what it was. But tonight there was just this room, these people, this work that mattered, and Lillian Rose, who had arrived here as someone else's plan and was leaving whenever she left as entirely irreversibly her own. The 16 days did not pass quietly. Harold Whitaker spent them the way. A man spent the last days of something he could feel ending. Not gracefully, not with dignity, but with the particular frantic energy of someone trying to outrun a conclusion that had already been written. On the 3rd day after the injunction was served, he sent a letter to every ranch and farm in Cutter County. Lillian read a copy that Roy brought back from town, and she recognized it immediately for what it was. Not a defense, not an explanation, but a performance of wounded dignity. Harold wrote that he was the victim of a coordinated campaign by outside interests seeking to destabilize the county's established commercial relationships. He wrote that Elias Carter had used a vulnerable young woman to execute a business takeover of the county's lending infrastructure. He wrote that the Rose family had been manipulated by powerful men who did not have the county's best interests at heart. He did not mention the $41,000. He did not mention the 11 families. He did not mention the column in his own ledger labeled Adjustment Revenue. Lillian read the letter twice, set it on the table, and looked at Elias. "He's terrified," she said. "Yes," Elias said. "A man who wasn't terrified wouldn't send this letter," she said. "This letter tells everyone that something is happening that Harold can't stop. People will read between those lines. Some will," he said. "Others will read exactly what Harold wrote and believe it." "Which ones concern you?" she asked. "None of them," he said. "The judge has the injunction. Corbett has the documents. What Harold tells the county now is noise." She appreciated that he said it plainly rather than reassuringly. There was a difference. Reassurance was about managing her feelings. Plainness was about respecting her intelligence. She had spent enough of her life with the former to deeply value the latter. On the 7th day, Harold did something that nobody expected. He went to Thomas Rose, not through a lawyer this time. Not through a letter. He came himself on horseback alone, which was so uncharacteristic that Thomas actually stepped outside to confirm what he was seeing before he let the man approach. Elias found out an hour later when Thomas rode to the ranch and told them. "He came himself," Thomas said. He was still processing it. She could see the particular unsettled look of a man who had prepared for one kind of confrontation and received a different one. "He sat at my kitchen table. He looked, I don't know how to describe it, like a man who's been awake for a week." "What did he say?" Lillian asked. Thomas looked at his hands. "He said he wanted to apologize," he said. "He said he made mistakes. He said the interest rate discrepancy was the result of a clerk's error that compounded over time and that he had not been monitoring his office carefully enough." He paused. "He said if I withdrew the original loan document from the court proceedings, he would not only honor the debt forgiveness, but would additionally compensate our family for any overcharges with interest." The room was completely still. Roy said quietly, "He's trying to settle. He's trying to narrow the case," Lillian said. Her voice was tight. "If he can get my father to withdraw the document, or even to publicly say he's satisfied with Harold's explanation, it creates doubt. It doesn't destroy the federal case, but it gives Harold's lawyer something to work with. A borrower who accepted private settlement weakens the argument of systematic fraud." She looked at Thomas. "What did you tell him?" Thomas Rose looked at her steadily. I told him the same thing I told his lawyer, he said. I told him the document stays where it is, and then I asked him to leave my property. She felt something move through her chest, not pride exactly, but something larger than pride. Something that had to do with watching a man she'd loved her whole life stand completely in his own character under the kind of pressure that could have bent someone with less internal architecture. He left, Elias asked. He sat there for another minute, Thomas said, looking at me, like he was waiting for me to change my mind. He paused. Then he said, Thomas, I hope you understand what you're choosing. And I told him I did. And then he left. Elias looked at Thomas with an expression that Lillian had come to recognize the expression he wore when he was seeing something he genuinely respected. Mr. Rose, he said, I want to say something. Thomas looked at him. I've done business in this territory for 18 years, Elias said. I've dealt with men who had a great deal more to lose than your family did when Harold Whitaker put pressure on them. Most of them found a reason to step back. He paused. You didn't. That matters not just to this case. It matters as a thing that happened in the world. Thomas Rose was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even but careful. My daughter told me the truth, he said. That's what made it possible. He looked at Lillian. You have to know the truth before you can choose it. She didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. She looked at the table instead. 12 days, she said when she had her voice back. Corbett arrives in 12 days. On the 11th day, Harold Whitaker made his final move. It was not what any of them anticipated, which was, she realized afterward, the point. Harold had spent weeks being predictable. The letter, the lawyer, the personal visit to Thomas, and they had all been watching for more of the same. What Harold did on the 11th day was the move of a man who understood that predictable pressure had stopped working, and that the only thing left was the unexpected. He filed a counter-complaint with the county circuit court. The complaint named Elias Carter as a defendant, alleging that the water channel project constituted unauthorized commercial expansion onto county water rights, and that the supply cooperative structure Lillian had drafted, which Elias had formally announced 3 days earlier, represented an illegal business combination under territorial commerce statutes. The complaint was, as Archibald Fenn explained to Elias over telegraph the following morning, largely without legal merit. But it didn't need merit to work. It needed time. A counter-complaint required response filings. Response filings took days. Days could push the circuit court timeline past Corbett's arrival date, creating a gap in which Harold could argue that the federal review was premature. He's not trying to win in court, Lillian said when Fenn's message had been read and set down. He's trying to create noise in the timeline. He could get a week, Elias said. Maybe 10 days. Which pushes past Corbett, Roy said. Not necessarily, Daniel Webb said. He had been sitting quietly through all of this, which was his way gathering before speaking. Corbett isn't bound by the circuit court's schedule. He's federal. He can review the documents independently of what the county court is doing. He paused. The counter-complaint delays the circuit injunction. It doesn't touch the federal investigation. But it gives Harold a platform, Lillian said. A public filing he can point to and say, see, this is disputed. This is complicated. These are not clear-cut allegations against a simple fraudster. These are two powerful men with competing commercial interests. Which is exactly how he'll describe it, Elias said. She stood and walked to the window, and stood there with her back to the room for a moment. She was thinking. She could feel them watching her think, which she had stopped being self-conscious about somewhere around day 9 of this. The particular unself-consciousness that comes from being in a room where people trusted your thinking enough to wait for it. She turned around. The 11 families, she said. Everyone looked at her. Harold's counter-complaint names Elias, she said. It frames this as a dispute between two commercial interests. Two powerful men. As long as it stays framed that way, Harold has a story to tell. She looked at Elias, then at Roy, then at Daniel. But it's not a dispute between two commercial interests. It's a dispute between Harold Whitaker and 11 families who lost money they couldn't afford to lose. She paused. We need those families in the room when Corbett arrives. Not their documents. Them, their faces, their names, their voices. Daniel said Corbett's review is a federal proceeding. Witness presence. I'm not talking about the proceeding, she said. I'm talking about before the proceeding, the day Corbett arrives in Billings. Before he sits down with the documents, before Harold's lawyer has the chance to set the frame, we put 11 families in that room, or as many as will come. She looked at the group. Because when a federal attorney walks in and sees 11 farming families sitting in a room with their original loan documents, that is not a complicated commercial dispute between powerful men. That is a fraud case. Immediately, visually, undeniably. The room was quiet. Roy said, "How many of the 11 will come?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I happy to ask them." "You have 1 day," Elias said. "Corbett arrives tomorrow evening." "Then I'll start now," she said. She spent the rest of that day writing. Not elegantly. Not with a plan beyond the first move. She went to the closest farm, first the Grayson Holt property, where Grayson had already given them his document and was, she knew, already inclined toward action. He said yes before she finished the sentence. His wife packed a bag for a one-night trip to Billings while he was still talking. The second farm was harder. The Pemberton family, old George Pemberton, who had been in the county for 40 years and who had lost the most acreage of anyone in Harold's scheme. He opened his door, listened to her, and said, "My lawyer told me not to get involved in anything formal." "This isn't formal yet," she said. "This is just a room with other people who understand what you've been through. You can leave before it becomes formal if you decide to." He looked at her for a long time. He was a man who had learned through 40 years of frontier living to assess risk carefully and to trust slowly. She understood that. She didn't rush him. "My wife would want to come," he said finally. "There's room," she said. By evening she had reached 7 of the 11 families. 5 said yes immediately. 2 needed a day that she didn't have. She made a different argument to those 2. She told them that the decision they were making was not about bravery or risk. It was about whether they wanted the record to show that they were there when the truth was told. That was all. Just being present. Just being counted. Both of them came. 7 families. 7 sets of documents. 7 voices that could say in one room what no legal filing could say, with the same weight that Harold Whitaker had looked at us and seen people he thought would not fight back, and use that calculation as a business model. She got back to Carter Ranch at 9 o'clock that night. She was tired in the particular way of someone who had spent a day asking things of people who had good reasons to say no, and had said yes anyway. Elias was waiting in the front room. Not performing waiting, just there with coffee, in the way he was simply present in spaces without needing to fill them. 7, she said, sitting down. 7 is enough, he said. Is it? 7 families with original documents and consistent testimony is not a complicated case, he said. It's an open one. He looked at her. You did that in 1 day. They wanted someone to ask, she said. That was most of it. They'd been sitting with this for years, and nobody with the means to do something had ever actually asked them to participate in fixing it. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. People aren't passive because they don't care. They're passive because they don't see a door. He looked at her for a moment. In that way he had the quality of attention that felt like being read accurately rather than being assessed. Lillian, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it. She registered that without making anything of it in her expression. Yes, she said. When this is over, he said, I want to say something to you that I've been thinking about for several weeks and haven't said because the timing has never been right, and also because you would have told me the timing was wrong. She looked at him. The timing might still be wrong, she said. I know, he said. I'm going to say it anyway. He set his cup down. You came here because Harold Whitaker put you in an impossible position, and you found the one honest response to it. You stayed because there was work worth doing. You've done that work not because I provided the resources, or Roy provided the operations, or Daniel provided the legal access. Because you saw what needed to be done, and you did it. He paused. I don't want you to leave because you think the work is finished, because it isn't, and because... He stopped. Started again. Because I have spent 18 years in this county building something, and I did not know until you walked into my yard what I was missing. And what I was missing was someone who thought the way you thought and spoke the way you spoke and refused to be what anyone else needed her to be. She did not look away from him. She did not fill the silence with something easier than the truth. I'm 22 years old, she said. I know. You're 38. I know that too. And I arrived here as a scheme, she said. You arrived here as yourself, he said. The scheme was Harold's. You've never been part of it. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had surprised her every single day, who had never once offered her comfort when he could offer her something more useful, who had never once looked at her the way the town looked at her, who had put her original document in the cedar box right next to what mattered and asked for nothing in return, except that she be exactly who she already was. Ask me again, she said. After tomorrow, after Corbett, after Harold is finished and the case is closed and I've had time to know what I think without a federal deadline in the way. He nodded once. All right, he said. All right, she said. They sat in that room for another hour, not talking about what had just been said, but talking about tomorrow, about the families who were riding to Billings in the morning, about the documents and the timing, and the specific things Corbett would need to see first. They talked about the cooperative, and the water channel, and the Pemberton farm, and what it would take to recover the soil on the north properties that Harold's scheme had destroyed. They talked about everything except what they had just said to each other. But it was there in the room, between the words, in the quality of the quiet, when the talking stopped. It had been building since the first morning in the yard, since the cornbread on the first day. Since every table they had sat across from each other and worked through something that mattered. It was not rushed. It was not performed. It was simply real, which was, she had come to understand, the only kind of thing worth having. U.S. Attorney Corbett was a small man with large glasses and the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had been lied to professionally for 20 years and had developed a comprehensive immunity to being impressed by anything except evidence. He arrived in Billings on the evening of October 28th and was in the meeting room at the Federal Land Office by 8 o'clock the following morning. He walked in to find 7 farming families from Cutter County, Montana, sitting in chairs along the wall, 7 sets of original loan documents, 7 payment histories, 1 private ledger copied from the Helena Land Office with the column labeled Adjustment Revenue in Harold Whitaker's own handwriting, and Lillian Rose standing at the front of the room with the particular stillness of someone who had been preparing for this moment for longer than she had known she was preparing for it. Corbett looked at the room. He looked at the families. He looked at Lillian. Miss Rose, he said. Daniel Webb's telegraph described the case. I'd like to hear it from the beginning. How much time do you have? She asked. As much as it takes, he said. She told him everything. Not the emotional version. Not the narrative she might have told around a fire. The legal version. The documented version. The version that moved from the original agreements to the payment records, to the ledger column, to the land transfer histories, to the holding company, to the dead woman's estate. She told it in sequence with reference to specific documents with the 7 families available to confirm their own portions of the story. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. Corbett listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions. All 3 were exactly the right questions. The questions that identified the structural core of the case, the points where the evidence was strongest, and the points where it needed support. She answered all 3 directly. When she finished, Corbett looked at the room for a moment. Then he said, I need to see Harold Whitaker's original ledger, not a copy the original. It's filed at the Helena Land Office as a corporate document, Daniel Webb said from the back of the room. Accessible under federal subpoena. Then I'll issue one today, Corbett said. He opened his case and began writing. Elias, sitting quietly to the side with Roy throughout all of this, looked at Lillian. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Harold Whitaker's lawyer arrived at noon and spent 45 minutes in a separate room with Corbett presenting the counter-narrative, the complicated commercial dispute story, the clerk's error explanation, the suggestion that Elias Carter's supply cooperative was itself a monopolistic scheme. Corbett listened to all of it. Then he issued the subpoena for the original ledger. Harold's lawyer objected to the subpoena. Corbett overruled the objection with the patient efficiency of a man who had heard that objection many times before and had issued many subpoenas afterward. The ledger arrived from Helena 4 days later. It matched Daniel's copies exactly. Every column, every figure, every entry in the adjustment revenue column in Harold Whitaker's own handwriting, covering 7 years of systematic intentional documented fraud against 11 farming families in Cutter County, Montana. Harold Whitaker's lawyer stopped objecting to things on the 5th day. On the 6th day, Harold Whitaker's lawyer asked for a settlement conference. The settlement conference lasted 2 days. Lillian sat in for the Rose family, which Harold's lawyer initially objected to, and Corbett overruled with the same patient efficiency he applied to all objections. The settlement required Harold Whitaker to pay full restitution to all 11 families. Principal, overcharged interest, and compounding damages. It required the transfer of the 3 North Farm properties back to their original families, plus compensation for years of lost use. It required the dissolution of Halcyon Land Trust and Western Agricultural Partners. It required Harold's withdrawal from all county lending operations. And it required a formal federal finding of fraud, which would follow Harold Whitaker into every business register, every county record, every professional context for the rest of his life. He was not sent to prison. The lawyer negotiated that. Corbett accepted it because the restitution was complete and the evidence of ongoing operation was broken. Lillian thought about that, whether it was enough. Whether a man who had spent 7 years systematically destroying families deserved something harsher. She sat with that question for 2 days after the settlement was signed, turning it over the way you turned over something with uneven edges, feeling for where it was sharp and where it was dull. She came to an imperfect peace with it. Not because the justice was complete, it wasn't, but because what had been restored was real. The Pemberton land was Pemberton land again. The 3 North Farms were going back to the families who had worked them. 11 sets of records had been corrected. $41,000 plus damages would be distributed to the people Harold had taken it from. That was not everything, but it was not nothing, and nothing is what Harold had intended them to have. The day after the settlement was signed, Lillian Rose rode back to Carter Ranch alone. Not because she needed to be alone exactly, but because she wanted the ride, the open air, the cold October light, the 3 miles of road that she had traveled so many times in the past weeks that her horse moved through it without being guided. She wanted to feel the space between what had just ended and what was going to begin. She arrived at the ranch to find Thomas, Rose, and May sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, which had become over the past weeks entirely normal. Her father at the Carter Ranch table. May refilling his cup without asking, the two of them talking with the comfortable ease of people who had been in each other's company long enough to stop being formal about it. Elias was in the south barn. She found him there, not because she'd been told, but because that was where he was in the mornings when he didn't have somewhere else to be. She had learned the geography of his days, the way you learned the geography of any place you'd lived in long enough to stop looking at a map. He looked up when she came in. "It's done," she said. "Roy told me," he said. "He got word this morning." He set down what he was doing and looked at her properly. "How do you feel?" She thought about that honestly. "Like someone who has been running for a long time and has just stopped," she said. "Everything is still moving inside me, but I've stopped." He nodded. He understood that. "I said I'd ask you again," he said, "after it was over." "Yes," she said. "You did." "Then I'm asking," he said. Not dramatically, not with any performance of the magnitude of the question. Just plainly the way he said everything. "Stay. Not because there's more work to do, there's always more work to do, but because this is where you belong. Because in the past 6 weeks, I have watched you think and fight and tell the truth in rooms that didn't want to hear it, and I have not once wanted you to be anywhere other than where you were." He looked at her steadily. "Stay because you want to, not because you're needed, not because of the cooperative or the farm or any practical thing, because you want to be here, if you do." She looked at this man, This particular, serious, surprising man who had never once looked at her with anything other than the full weight of his complete attention. Who had never once offered her less than the truth. Who had put a chair at his table and expected her to use it from the very first morning, and had never once suggested she should want anything other than exactly what she already was. She thought about the girl who had packed a suitcase with 2 changes of clothes and a book and her mother's journal and ridden to a stranger's ranch to deliver a warning. She thought about what that girl had believed about herself, then what she had been told to believe, what the town had decided she was, what Harold Whitaker had calculated she was worth. And she thought about what she knew now, not because Elias Carter had taught her, not because being at Carter Ranch had changed her, but because the past 6 weeks had given her room to see what had always been there: the intelligence, the stubbornness, the capacity for truth-telling, the refusal to be used as something less than what she was. She had always been worth this. She had simply needed a room big enough to prove it. "Yes," she said, one word. But in the way she said it, certain, complete, without reservation, it was everything the moment required, and nothing it didn't. Elias nodded once. Something in his face settled, not relief, because he was not a man built for relief, but the particular quality of a large weight finding its right resting place. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. "Good." They stood together in the quiet of the barn for a moment, not touching, not performing anything for anyone, just present in the same space, with the simple, solid reality of 2 people who had chosen each other clearly and honestly and without pretense. Outside, the channel water was running. Thomas Rose was drinking coffee with May at the kitchen table. The Pemberton family was signing papers to reclaim their land. The cooperative structure Lillian had written in one long day was already in the hands of 8 families who would build it together through the winter. And in Red Hollow, Montana, in the late autumn of 1887, people were beginning to tell a different story than the one Harold Whitaker had written for them, the story of a poor farmer's daughter who had arrived at the richest ranch in the county with nothing but a warning and the absolute refusal to be what anyone expected her to be. They called her the woman who broke the scheme. They called her the one who brought the families home. And Elias Carter, whenever anyone asked him why he had chosen the poorest girl in the county, the girl everyone had dismissed, the girl Harold had sent as a weapon, the girl who had arrived with a mended dress and a cedar box document and 2 sleepless nights of clear thinking, behind her eyes always gave the same answer. He said, "I didn't choose her." He said, "She walked into my yard and told me the truth when she had every reason not to." He said, "A woman like that doesn't need to be chosen. She just needs one person to stop underestimating her long enough to see what's actually standing in front of them." He said, "I was just smart enough to be that person." And gold, true gold, was never what glittered in a man's pocket, or gleamed in a county ledger, or accumulated in a lending office column labeled adjustment revenue. Gold was what Lillian Rose had carried every mile of her life, in every field she worked, and every truth she told, and every room she walked into, refusing to be less than herself. It had always been there. It had always been enough. It had always been worth more than anything